Just like Express, Mongoose also has the concept of middleware. And so let's now learn about the first type of middleware, which is Document Middleware. Now, just like with Express, we can use Mongoose middleware to make something happen between two events. For example, each time a new document is saved to the database, we can run a function between the save command is issued and the actual saving of the document, or also after the actual saving. And that's the reason why Mongoose middleware is also called pre and post hooks. So again, because we can define functions to run before or after a certain event, like saving a document to the database. Alright? So middleware is an absolutely fundamental concept in Mongoose, so just like in Express. And there are tons of possibilities and use cases for middleware, and we're going to be using middleware all the time in this project. So, there are 4 types of middleware in Mongoose: document, query, aggregate, and model middleware. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about document middleware, which is middleware that can act on the currently processed document. Okay, so just like the virtual properties, we define a middleware on the schema. So tour schema dot pre. Okay, and so this is for pre-middleware, which again is going to run before an actual event. And that event in this case is the save event. And so this callback function that we're going to define here next, so function, so this function will be called before an actual document is saved to the database. Okay, so this is document middleware, and it runs, and let me write all of that here, so it runs before the save command and the .create command, all right? But not on insert many. So if we use this command here, so insert many, then that will actually not trigger the save middleware, all right? So always keep that in mind. It's very important to realize that only on save and on create, actually this middleware here is going to be executed, okay? And so let's start by doing a simple console.log. And what I'm going to log to the console is this. Okay? And so in a save middleware, the this keyword here is going to point to the currently processed document. And that is the reason why it is called document middleware. Again, because in this function here, we have access to the document that is being processed. So in this case, the document that is being saved. Okay, and so let me just very quickly show that to you using this console.log. And so in order to now trigger this function, remember we need to run a save command or a create command. And so we now need to create a new tour using our API in order to then trigger this middleware. All right. So let's go here to Postman, and I'm going to start by saving these 2 new routes that we created in the previous lectures. So get monthly plan, and this one here is get tour stats. All right, so now I can close them and create new tour, and we specify the data here in the body. Now, not all of the stuff here is actually required, so let's take a look at what actually is required and get rid of the rest. So the image cover is required, the summary, of course the price, and so let's get rid of the stuff that we don't really need here, just to keep it at a minimum. So the ratings, quantity, average, so these are not necessary. So I'm just going to call this one here the test tour, just to keep it really simple here. Okay, now let's send this request. And indeed, it created the new document. And now let's take a look at our console and see that document here. And indeed, here it is. So Let's increase this here a little bit. And so this is what our document is looking like right before it's saved into the database. Okay? And so here we have like ratings, average, and quantity, which are set by default. Remember, so 4.5 and 0. And then like the created at timestamp. And you can even see the virtual property that we defined here. All right. So again, this is right before we actually save this data to the database. And so at this point of time, we can still act on the data before it is then saved to the database. And that is exactly what we're going to do now. All right. So down here in our middleware function. And what I want to do here is to create a slug for each of these documents. So remember how in the first section we created a slug for each of the products that we had in the store, right? And so a slug is basically just a string that we can put in the URL, usually based on some string like the name. So in this case, we're going to create a slug based here on the tour name, all right? So remember how for that we used the Slugify package. And so let's now go ahead and install that. All right, and while that's doing, let's go ahead and then require it here. So require Slugify. All right, let's go back to our first window here actually. And now down here, we no longer want to log this to the console, but instead we can now say this, and remember, this is the currently processed document. So we can now define a new property on it. And that's exactly what I'm doing. So this.slug should be Slugify, and then just a string that we want to create a slug out of. And so that's going to be this.name. And then we also want to pass in the option that everything should be converted to lowercase. And so that's lower true. Okay, and now give it a save. And one thing that we didn't talk about yet is the next function. Okay, so just like in Express, we also have the next function in Mongoose middleware, basically to call the next middleware in the stack, as we already know. Now in this case, we only have one middleware function, which is why we didn't run into any problems even not calling next, but let's actually now do that. Okay, and so each middleware function in a pre-save middleware has access to next. Okay, so that's exactly the same as in Express. And so by the end of the middleware, we call next, and that will then call the next middleware in the stack. All right, so let's try this out again. And this is going to be called test tour number 2. All right, so very simple. Send this guy, and let's wait for it. And now for some reason it's not really here. Let's see if we got some error. And we actually did not. But the reason why it's not working is that right now we don't have any slug in our schema, right? And remember, this actually happened to us before when we only had a couple of fields in the schema. And when we then would define some fields that were not in the schema, then they were simply not persisted to the database. And the same thing is now happening here. So we defined the slug property, but it's not in our schema. And therefore, it was then not saved to the database. And so let's quickly fix that. Let's put it, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. You can put it here right after the name. So the slug should simply be a string. Okay, and so that should fix it. So let's go back and create the test tour number 3. Because it cannot be the same, because remember, we cannot have tours with the same name. So do it again. And now indeed we have the slug property right here. And it is indeed based on the name, as you can see here. Great. So let's go back here. I'm going to reduce this a little bit. And so here we have the pre-document middleware. Let's now just very quickly experiment also with a post middleware. All right. So tour schema dot post, and let's use save again. All right. And then the callback function which in the case of post middleware has access not only to next, but also to the document that was just saved to the database. So let's call that one doc, and then next. All right, and so post middleware functions are executed after all the pre-middleware functions have completed. All right, so in here we actually no longer have the this keyword, but instead we have the basically finished document here in doc. So let's just log that finished document to the console and then call next. Now in this case again, we only have one post middleware, and so we wouldn't really need next, but it's a best practice to simply always include it. All right. Now another thing that I wanted to show you is that we can have, of course, multiple pre-middlewares or also post-middlewares for the same hook. All right. And hook is what we call this save here, okay? So this middleware here is basically what we call a pre-save hook, okay? So you will see that terminology all the time. So some call it middleware and some call it hooks, okay? And so this is going to be a pre-save hook or pre-save middleware. Okay, so function, and this one has access to next. And so let's just log something to the console here, like will save document, and then next. And that, of course, should be next. All right. Just to see if we get some error, I'm going to omit the next here. Okay, just to see what happens when we do not call it. All right. So I'm going to create a new tour, and by the end of this lecture, I'm going to delete all of them. But for now, we need them here. Okay, and so now you see that it's not really finishing. So we're stuck in that one middleware function that doesn't have the next call. All right, so basically we're stuck in here. So let's cancel the request and then get it back here and try that again. And so now it worked indeed. So our slug is here, right? And so let's take a look at our console. And so indeed, our second pre-middleware also run. So the one logging will save document, and then our post middleware then log to the console the final document. And so that should also already have the slug. And yeah, here it is. All right, and that's actually all I had to show you about Document Middleware. Now I'm just gonna comment out these two here, okay, because I don't want to pollute my log here all the time with these console.logs, but I'm still keeping them here again as a reference. All right, so what I want you to remember from this lecture is that we can have middleware running before and after a certain event. And in the case of Document Middleware, that event is usually the save event, okay? And then in the middleware function itself, we have access to the this keyword, which is going to point at the currently being saved document, all right? And it's also very important to keep in mind that this save middleware only runs for the save and create mongoose methods. It's not going to run, for example, for insert many, and also not for find one and update, or find by ID and update, which we already used before. So for example, somewhere here we have find by ID and update, but that is not going to trigger this save middleware. Okay, so that's very important to keep in mind, because actually a bit later in this project we will have to work around that limitation. All right, so this is Document Middleware to manipulate documents that are currently being saved. Next up, we're going to talk about Query Middleware.